verses here. But we'll go back and talk a little bit about how we got here to this lesson today. Who was the author of Esther? Do we know? Yeah, it says we don't know. A lot of people think it could have been Mordecai, her uncle. But again, we're not really for sure who the author is. And the time period here. The time period is about 483 BC. It said the king, that's here we're talking about, he was 32 years old. It was in the third year of his reign, so it was, he became king in 486. So that's about around 500 years before the birth of Christ. And again, they say this is probably one of the last books written in the Old Testament. It's also one of the, I'm getting this from our book today, but it was one of the other, there's only 2 books named after women, and this is, Ruth was one of them, and of course Esther. And of course Ruth was written around before King Saul became king during the Judges. So there's a big time span, probably 600-700 years between their writings. It's also in the history part of the Bible. The first 5 books of the Bible are the law. Then we get to Joshua through the next 12. Joshua, there's 12 books of history. It was starting with Joshua and ending with Ruth. Those are the history books. Also, too, it mentioned that God is not. We'll talk about this in a few minutes. God's not ever mentioned in this book. It's never. But and even though He's not mentioned, we see God in control and God at work during this book. So we'll see that as we go through the next few weeks. Also, where are the Jewish people during this time? The people that we're writing about in Esther, where are they located at? Yeah, everywhere. Yeah. In other words, they're not in Jerusalem. They're outside. They're in the Persian Empire, but the Jews that are spread. Actually, in this book we're going to read in this one area here, the Persian Empire. But the Jews, that they were. We'll get to that in just a minute. They're not back in their homeland there. So the question is, how do we get to this where we're at today? We'll back up here. We talked back in this past summer about King David, and King David was around about 500 years before this happened. But King David, became king. The Messiah was always promised through his seed, King David, and we knew that King David, even through all of his faults, he did have, he was a man after God's own heart. When King David died, he picked his son Solomon. Of all of his, we studied about all of his children and how he had all the problems with them. But Solomon ended up being the new king. Solomon was the richest and the wisest man in the world. But eventually, Solomon fell into, he married so many wives and stuff. He became involved in idolatry, and he sort of fell away from God. So when Solomon died, after his death, we had the nation split. We had the divided kingdom. And we had the 10 northern tribes and the 2 southern tribes, which were Judah and Benjamin, which, we pretty much refer to as Benjamin. And, of course, we had a lot of bad kings. The southern kingdom luckily had a few good kings, but we had bad kings, good kings, So in 7, what was this? The northern kingdom was, I think it's 730 BC, somewhere in there. Maybe it's a little bit later. But anyway, the Syrians, who were in power at the time, took over the northern kingdom. Of course, the southern kingdom, lasted probably a little bit more than 100 years. And, around 600 BC, they were captured by the Babylonians and taken off into captivity. And of course, during that time, they had been warned through the judges, not through the judges, through the prophets. Turn away from your evil, turn away from your idolatrous worship, but they never did. So, but during all this time, during all the prophecies and stuff, God always promised them that a remnant would return to their promised land there. So, yes, 721, the Syrians were captured. That's where I had it written down. So they went off into so the southern kingdom, Judah, went off into Babylonian captivity, and after 70 years, the Babylonians were defeated by the Medes and the Persians. So during this time we've talked about so far, we see the Syrians were a world power who were defeated by the Babylonians, who now have been defeated by the Persians, and therefore now during this time we're talking about the Persian Empire is what we're studying during this time. When they were defeated, of course, Cyrus became king in 539 BC, and he decided that they were pretty liberal. They had been under the Babylonian captivity. He sent the Jews back to their homeland. Those who wanted to go, there's around 50,000 of them. We read in Scripture that went back to their homeland. Of course, he sent them back. He gave them food and he gave them shelter. He gave them money. He gave them the means to go back and rebuild Jerusalem. So that's when we read, I think the next 6 months from now, we'll study Ezra and Nehemiah. That will be about the Jews that returned back to Jerusalem. But for our study this quarter, it's going to be about Esther. And these are for the Jews who did not return to Jerusalem. These are the Jews who basically lived and stayed in the Persian, or where the Babylonians had taken them, which had been over, went off to Babylon, but now all of a sudden they were inside the Persian Empire. These are about the Jews who stayed in Persia, or Babylon, Babylonian Empire, but stayed in that area. And you almost might say these are the disobedient Jews, because again, they were promised their homeland. Through their forefathers, Isaac and Abraham, they were promised this land, and when they had the opportunity to return, they didn't. And of course, part of the reason would be, they lived in this land for, you got to realize this was. If they went into captivity around 600, 580, 586, whatever BC, this is 480. This is actually, of course, the Jews returned in 539 BC, but this is another 50, 60 years later. None of these Jews had ever lived in Jerusalem. None of these Jews had ever been to Jerusalem, So the reason they weren't going back, even when they had a chance to go back, probably was because they had, become part of the society there. They had family there, going back to an area which had been destroyed. I mean, we see the pictures of what's happening over in the Middle East right now. You could imagine going back. Of course, we have we have the things and the means to rebuild things like that. But still, during their time, if you were to be in a war zone and go back and try to rebuild, that would be a daunting task. So again, you can see why a lot of them decided to stay. So again, before we get, just to sum it all up, where we're at here now is 500 years basically after the death of David. 500 years before the birth of Christ, give or take a few years. The Jews are in the Persian Empire. And again, we're going to read about all the events of, and again, like I said, this is probably the last time we talk about Esther, but all the events that she, the things that happened that allow this Jewish race to live through this time, because we'll see here later on, that their existence is threatened. But again, that's what this book is about. And also, too, another thing interesting before we get started, the area that we're talking about here today with this Shushan, I'll look at here again. That area, where's that today at? Anybody read that? Iran, yeah. This is modern-day Iran where we're studying this lesson at today. So that was interesting. So anybody have any comments or questions before we get started? Again, I apologize today. This lesson is more like a history lesson. We got to sort of find out where we're at and stuff, and also too, not get into further lessons down the road. We want to be careful not to get to the main points that are out there that we'll study throughout the next few weeks. So, question number 1. It said, most historians take, I could have said this before I walked up here today, Ahasuerus to be what well-known Persian ruler. Yeah, Xerxes. It's funny how I've said that name a dozen times this week, and I get up there, I can't even pronounce it all of a sudden. But Ahasuerus, I think our books mention that even though he and Xerxes are the same people, history doesn't really talk about his name. So it probably was, we just read about his name in the Bible here. So the way that we know that's him is because it's probably his Persian name, whereas Xerxes was a Greek name. Now it's interesting too, this gentleman we're talking about here, Xerxes. We'll just go ahead and I can say that easier than Ahasuerus. I actually said it that time. But anyway, he's probably the most powerful person in the world at this time, and probably one of the most powerful people ever, because of the position that he was in. Also, too, it's very interesting that there's a lot of information written about him. Because at this time, I think the guy named Herodias, there's a lot of secular writings about Xerxes. So we know a lot more about Xerxes than what we see here in the Bible. I read somewhere too, someone said, up until this point, this guy Herodias, who wrote about him, he was probably more of a neutral writer, because a lot of the writers during this time would probably write in favor of what the king or what they wanted to hear. So a lot of the writings that you received outside the Bible were sort of slanted because you didn't want the king to kill you. But this is a situation where what he wrote about him. So there's a lot of writings about the events that take place here today, not really with Ruth, but during his reign and stuff. So we can, you can look all that up. But again, he and Xerxes, there's a lot of information about it. You can Google Xerxes or whatever, and there's a lot of information, probably a lot of writings and movies about him. Question number 2. Who was the first king of the Persians? Cyrus, yeah. And we talked about that, a while ago. Cyrus was king when the Persians, or the Medes, whatever, they sort of came together when they captured the Babylonians, or they took, when they conquered the Babylonian Empire. Okay. Question number 3. What 2 Persian emperors established a dynasty after the death of Cambyses? Darius and Xerxes, yeah. I think the book mentioned that, of course, Cyrus was the first king of Persia. And then his son Cambyses became king after him. And he said he died. He had maybe some sort of a mental illness, they thought. But anyway, when Darius became king, Darius claimed to be kin to him. Now, whether or not he was kin to him or not, we don't know that, but he claimed to be. So whether or not if he was a rightful king or not, we don't really know. But Darius, Cyrus, when he was king, he had conquered Babylon. He'd sort of started building this empire. But then when Darius became king, he just expanded it. They conquered a lot of different other areas and stuff. So, we talked about the 127 providences or 127, use the word. But anyway, it was provinces, 127 provinces. So it was a large area. And Darius had built this large, and we'll get to, we'll probably have a map up. Al's good on maps. He'll probably have a map up next week and sort of talk about that to show how large of an area this was that this kingdom had expanded to. But again, and then when he died, Darius died, Xerxes, his son, became king. Of course, he inherited all this land from his father, or inherited the kingdom, I should say, from his father. And it was, it was again during this time, it was a global empire at the time. We read about Xerxes. Xerxes is probably, it was given to him, and I think a lot of people consider him to be like a sort of a narcissistic, spoiled rich kid, what it boils down to. And we see in the readings that we read today about how he displayed all of his wealth, how he was wanting to show off all the things that he had. That was probably, this was all given to him. And again, if you can imagine, again, we don't have a map up here, but the land that they covered, or that they had conquered, and that was given to Xerxes, was over probably around 3 different continents. It was spread across 3 different continents. It wasn't the full 3 continents, but it went all the way over to Greece, all the way to the Persian Gulf, all that area in there, you know, and again, he was ruler over all that land, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Greece, Turkey, just so many areas there that was all under one Persian Empire at the time. Any comments or questions so far? Again, I promise you next few weeks we'll definitely have more, probably have to put a lot more input into the lesson as far as class time, because like I said, again, a lot of this stuff is history, and again, we're trying to stay within these 9 verses today. Question number 4. What Persian emperor had his naval fleet destroyed by the Greeks in the channel of water between the mainland and the island of Salamis? Xerxes, yeah. And I think the author threw this in here, but I think this happens between chapter 1 and chapter 2. This event right here happens. What we're going to read about here in just a minute is when, or what we already read about, is when he has this great feast for 180 days. And during that period of time, it was thought that what he was doing, Xerxes was doing, was preparing to go to war against Greece, the Greeks. And so he's bringing all these officials in, trying to get, you know, their support, their money. Of course, he was showing his wealth too, but trying to get everybody together to go to war against the Greeks, what he was trying to do. Because the Greeks were becoming, you know, even though they were a world power and they owned all this, you know, the Greeks were starting to be a threat to them. And this actually, it lasted, I think it started, it said around 500, 490 BC, and it lasted, we always hear of Alexander the Great, because again, just like this, all empires, this, the Persian Empire is destroyed in around 150 years later, or not destroyed, but a new empire comes, the Greeks become the main, or the world power after, you know, about 150 years from now. So again, I think we've talked about 3 or 4 world powers that have already, you know, come and gone, and during this period of time we talked about today. But but what happens is, but Xerxes decided he was going to try to invade Greece, or he was trying to, so his military, his navy or whatever was sailing, and he was going to go to war with the Greeks. And there was like a narrow area there that the ships passed through, and some way or another his naval fleet was destroyed. So after that, you know, Xerxes, who we're talking about here, he lost the command of the sea there. So therefore, you know, he was defeated here. He didn't lose his empire though. Again, the Persian Empire is not defeated here. It's just that what happens, they sort of changed the way of doing things. You know, after, and again, this is after what we read about today though. But Xerxes, they're defeated. Basically, he comes back home and he dedicates his life to construction, building things and things of that nature, as opposed to trying to go back to war with the Greeks, because again, they're defeated here. But again, it doesn't. The Persian Empire still exists after this. And again, this happens for another 150 years. They go to war, then eventually, again, the Persian Empire is destroyed. Okay, question number 5. What is the Jewish diaspora? And what does the diaspora have to do with the book of Esther? Yeah, spreading out the people. And what does that have to do with Esther? You just answered it.
It gave them an opportunity to keep their nation alive in that area.
Right. They were spread, and it was just, they were there, you know, as a group there in the Persian Empire. But the Jews, you know, were spread out in multiple places. Question number 6. How many provinces did the Persian king rule over? 127. I think I read there somewhere it said about 3 million square miles, 3 continents, African, Asia, and Europe. And of course, you know, all these people, that's a large area. Until you got to realize, you know, to be a king of that area, you know, that required a lot of ability or skill, because you're not not everybody spoke the same language. You know, we're talking about multiple nations that he was king over, different currencies, different rules. I mean, laws. But you had to bring all those people under one rule there. So that was a daunting task. But again, it was able to be accomplished here. Question number 7. How long did the feast last to which all the people of the capital city were invited? 7 days, yeah. I misread that question. Okay, yeah, 7 days. That was the second feast. Yeah, and let me back up here too. The first feast, when he brought all the people in, I was talking about, you know, when he brought them in for the 180 days, that feast was there. And I may be wrong, but the way I read it, I think they were sort of coming and going type. You know, they all didn't. In other words, all the kings or all the rulers from all the important people from the 127 provinces all didn't show up for 180 days and party for 180 days and go home. I think it was that 180 days is more or less, it's sort of coming and going. They were strategizing, trying to get, you know, military input, you know, a feast, you know, it lasted for 180 days, you know. And then at the end of that, what Brian said, they had a feast for 7 days in which all the people were able to come. So everybody in the whole kingdom were able to come there and to this feast for 7 days. And but there's two different. But what he talked about, there's two different instances here. In the 180 days followed by the 7 days, so it was, you know, technically 187 total. But again, from the way I read it, you know, a lot of the commentaries talked about the 180 days of drinking, but I don't think that was. I mean, it was a feast there for 180 days, but I don't think all the things that we'll get up to next week about you know, probably the king was drunk when he asked for certain requests and stuff. I don't think that all happened to the last. I don't think the king walked around drunk for 170 days. I think that was just sort of the last 7 days where all the excessive drinking took place there. Question number 8. Where did the gold drinking cups used at the royal banquet come from? Yeah, various places they had conquered. You know, probably some of that even came from Jerusalem. You know, but it showed that the wealth that they had there at this time. You know, probably Shushan, which is, you know, the capital of the Persian Empire. But again, it's said in the book, or maybe somewhere, that there were multiple capitals. This just was not the only capital. This was the winter home of the king. So that's why he was in Iran during the winter months. But it was probably one of the highest concentrations of wealth in the world at that time, because all the money, all the taxes, all the 127 provinces, you know, 3 continents, all that money came into Shushan. So that's why they were able to have, you know, I think it said even at the set day of the feast, you know, the 7 days, everybody had their own personalized cup that they could drink out of, and it was a golden cup. It wasn't a red Solo cup. I mean, it was, you know, it was made out of gold. So I mean, it was, you know, it was a, you know, a lot of wealth there at this time. And again, like I said, you know, just make, you know, Darius, you know, when he was king, you know, not Xerxes, but his father, when he was king, you know, he expanded the kingdom really aggressive and you know, and conquering other nations and stuff. So again, you know, all that wealth, everywhere they had went and they had, you know, conquered, you know, all that stuff, you know, flowed back to the conquerors, I should say, and that was the Medes and the Persians, that were the Persians here at the time. Okay, question number 9. Which Persian king sent the Jews back to their homeland? Cyrus, yeah. Well, Cyrus, and again, we talked about it earlier. You know, were the Babylonians good to the Jews when they were there? Sort of a tricky question, but they wasn't harsh on them, but still they were under their rule and stuff. But I think when the Persians became involved and when they took over the kingdom, they gave them a lot more freedom, allowed them to go back to their homeland. I think they sort of came in. And I remember this years ago in the back class here, and I hadn't seen, but I remember a book we talked about years ago back, we were the young adults, we were young adults or older adults in the back classroom here. But anyway, I remember talking to one of the lessons about, that Cyrus or the Persians were pretty much superstitious. So one of the reasons they allowed the Jews to go back to the homeland because Cyrus wanted to please all the gods, you might say. So he was afraid that, he wanted to make sure everybody was happy. So it wasn't like, because he was probably, obviously, wasn't of the Jewish faith or didn't believe in the only God, the God and the creator of the heaven and the earth, but still, he wanted to make sure that he didn't anger anyone. And so I think it was a lot of, at the time it's talking about a lot, they were superstitious, and that was one of the reasons he allowed them to return home. But I didn't see that in the text I read preparing for this lesson. Okay. And question number 10. What was the wife of Xerxes who prepared a banquet for the women of the realm? Vashti, yeah. And, I think the lesson next week is the humiliation of Vashti. So again, we're not going to really talk about her a lot. We'll save that for next week. And I read this too, and again, it may come up in the next week's lesson, and I don't know, but she was possibly, and again, this is going back to show you Xerxes, how, I hate to use the word evil, not evil, but how the type of person he was. Vashti, it said that some people believe that was his brother's wife. He had taken her. Not only had he taken his brother's wife, his stepbrother. His stepbrother's wife and actually her daughter. So he took his wife and his niece as his own. Okay. So let's get over here to the discussion questions here. It says, while several purposes might be suggested for the book of Esther, what do you suppose the chief reason was the chief reason for the book? I read that so bad. Yeah, what was the reason for this book being written?
God's in control.
Yeah, God's in control. And we talked about earlier, God is not mentioned in this book, but yet we see, and even though he's not mentioned, you can see God working in the background. And I'm sure this question, again, I haven't looked at this book yet, but I've got a feeling this question will probably asked 6 times between now and the end of into this quarter here. But, it shows that, God's in the background. He's working. God's involved in the advance of in the lives of his people. I also read somewhere too that this book is no accident. All these things that happen, we'll read through over the next few weeks. It was sort of God's plan, if you can say. Not that God controls people, but He does put certain people in certain places. I think we talked about before. How God uses even God uses different nations. He used different nations like the Babylonians and the Syrians to punish the Jewish people for their disobedience. And so, God uses different people to accomplish different things.
Persecution, because although he's not mentioned, she's fasting, he's fasting, they're in sackcloth. It shows obedience under the Lord.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as well. And like I said, I didn't look more into the lesson this week, but there's a lot more to this question even where I'm even going today with this. But yeah, there's a lot to that. And I think as we go through this book, right now this is sort of just giving the preface of what's taking place here. Like I said, even though God's not mentioning, Mordecai, they were still practicing their beliefs, and they were doing they were still practicing their Jewish faith there, and which, unfortunately, again, could have caused the destruction of all the Jews there. But in the end, through God's sovereignty and stuff, that they were saved in His plan. Mm-hmm.
Earlier I said Mordecai was Esther's uncle. His actions were
Well, I agreed with you because I thought it was her uncle. So it is her cousin. Okay.
his uncle was the one that died, and he took Esther to raise.
Okay. Well, when you said that, I agreed with you because I thought it was her uncle.
Well, I wanted to correct that.
Yeah.
When I said it, I thought, no, I think it was her cousin.
Yeah, you would think that an older cousin would be an uncle, but yeah, I think, yeah, you're right, but I agreed with you on that one. Yeah, had you not told me, I would still thought I'm glad you corrected me, because I would probably for the next 12 weeks talked about her uncle, Mordecai. You get something in your head, you just think it's right. Okay, question number 2. If Esther had little religious value, why do you suppose it is part of the Old Testament? Yeah, keep up with the Jews, yeah. It's showing where the Jews are at, and showing, because, again, a lot of times it gives us a different perspective of the Jews. A lot of times we're seeing the Jewish nation inside, and we'll see that in Ezra and Nehemiah here 6 months from now, the Jewish people in Jerusalem. But this book is different. The fact it's the Jewish people in a foreign land, and how they, again, like Mike said, how they lived in that foreign land and what they did. But again, but we talked about God, there's no reference to God, there's no prophecies, there's no miracles, there's no direct intervention. I shouldn't say direct, but no direct intervention, like with miracles and stuff like that. But we do see that God definitely has a big hand in the events that take place. And question number 3, why might the feast of the Persian Empire be better labeled a drinking party than a feast? It was open, yeah, that's exactly right. In other words, he told them to drink all you wanted to drink. And at that time, and he told his people, his court and stuff to allow them to drink, because up until this point, if you'd been the king's present, the king was supposed to drink before you were allowed to drink. You just weren't allowed to just, to drink at will. But here, he allowed that to happen, and just drink, be merry for 7 days. And, of course, that's probably not I don't think drinking for 7 days is good in any culture, especially our culture today. And, sometimes makes you wonder, and we'll probably end on this, but, we've talked about the alcohol content of what they had back then. I've heard people talk about it, but I don't know. Like I said, you just wonder how you could do that for 7 days, if the alcohol content was like it was in our day and time today. So, again, apologize. Again, there wasn't probably as much input into this lesson this week as we would like to have, but hopefully moving forward we can, because, again, like I said, there's a lot more to talk about today, but like I said, it's more or less just like a little history lesson to sort of get us to where we're at and sort of set us up for the next few weeks. So, we'll get to that next week. I have no idea. I don't know if he even tells us or not, but we'll find that out. Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah, we'll find that out.
There ain't much talked about Esther and Ruth, really.
No.